Thanksgiving had always been Martha's favorite holiday. My late wife used to say that nothing mattered more than gathering family around a warm table when the air outside was sharp with frost. She believed food could heal wounds, words never could. Even when money was tight, she'd find a way to make a turkey stretch, piling the table high with roasted potatoes, pumpkin pie, and her famous cornbread stuffing. This year was different. 6 months had passed since she'd slipped quietly from this world, leaving me alone in a house that echoed with her absence. I thought the grief would soften by now, but it still cut deep every morning when I poured coffee for one. Maybe that was why I decided almost on impulse to drive out to my daughter's house in Mason, Ohio on Thanksgiving afternoon. She hadn't answered my last 2 calls, and something in my gut told me I needed to see her with my own eyes. The sky had already turned heavy gray when I pulled onto I-75 snow swirling in fat, lazy flakes that promised trouble. Weather alerts hummed on the radio between the classic rock songs Martha and I used to sing along to. I kept both hands on the wheel, my old Chevrolet rumbling steady beneath me. The truck had been my workhorse for decades, hauling lumber groceries, furniture, and later even Emily's belongings when she moved into her first apartment. It still carried the faint scent of motor oil and leather that reminded me of long shifts at the factory. On the passenger seat sat 2 small packages. The first was a soft wool scarf, deep burgundy, chosen carefully to match Emily's winter coat. The second was more personal, a small velvet box holding her mother's silver necklace. Martha had worn it on every holiday, the pendant catching light like a piece of captured fire. Before she passed, she pressed it into my palm and whispered, "Give this to Emily when she needs strength." I'd kept it close, waiting for the right moment. The snow thickened as the miles passed. Cars crawled along with hazard lights flashing like nervous fireflies in the gray. I stopped once at a gas station where fluorescent lights cut harshly through the storm. Inside, a young clerk with tired eyes rang up my coffee and warned me the roads were worsening. I nodded, thanked him, and carried the steaming cup back to my truck. The warmth seeped into my hands, but not my heart. I couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in my chest. By 3 o'clock, the drive that normally took 40 minutes stretched past an hour. Wipers fought against the buildup of ice as exit signs appeared, then vanished in the white curtain. I thought about Emily, my only daughter. The little girl who once begged me to lift her onto my shoulders so she could watch the Thanksgiving parade floats. The teenager who helped her mother bake pies, laughing when flour dusted her nose. The young woman who stood trembling but radiant in her wedding dress when she married Mark 3 years ago. I'd worried about him even then. Something in his eyes too sharp, too controlling. Martha, ever the peacemaker, told me not to judge too quickly. "Love will soften him," she said. I wanted to believe her, so I held my tongue. But fathers notice things others don't. I noticed the way he corrected Emily in front of guests, the way his compliments always carried a shadow of criticism. Still, she insisted she was happy, and I wanted her happiness more than anything. The snow eased slightly as I took the Mason exit and turned onto suburban streets lined with 2-story homes. Pumpkins and autumn wreaths decorated porches, and already Christmas lights twinkled through the storm, casting warm glows onto snow-blanketed lawns. Behind each window, families gathered around dining tables, laughter spilling into the night. I imagined the clink of silverware, the aroma of turkey and cinnamon pie. Thanksgiving as it should be. When I finally turned onto Maplewood Drive, my heart lifted a little at the sight of Emily's house. The blue 2-story stood at the end of the block, white shutters trimmed neatly, smoke curling from the chimney. Holiday lights framed the porch, cheerful and bright despite the storm. Mark's black SUV sat in the driveway, along with 2 other cars I didn't recognize, probably his parents or siblings. It looked like the kind of scene Martha would have adored, a postcard of domestic warmth. I slowed the truck, already picturing Emily opening the door in an apron, cheeks flushed from cooking, greeting me with surprise that would quickly melt into joy. Maybe this visit would bring us closer again, help ease the distance that had grown since Martha's death. I parked behind the line of cars, the engine ticking as it cooled. The scarf and necklace waited beside me, silent promises of love and memory. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was a trick of the storm, a shadow moving against the porch. But as I leaned closer, my breath fogging the glass, I realized it was Emily, my Emily. She sat on the front steps, knees pulled tight to her chest, arms wrapped around herself. No coat, no hat, not even gloves. Just a thin blouse and skirt clothes that belonged to warmth, not this bitter cold. Snow clung to her hair, her lips blue, her skin pale against the storm. I stumbled out of the truck, the wind cutting like knives across my face. My boots crunched through the snow as I hurried toward her. The warmth of holiday lights glowed behind her through the window, faint music, and bursts of laughter spilling from inside. Inside, her husband's family feasted oblivious or uncaring. Outside, my daughter shivered frozen like a discarded ornament. Her eyes flicked up when she heard me. Relief, shame, and pain swirled together in them. "Dad," she whispered, voice trembling. "You shouldn't have come." I dropped my coat over her shoulders, the wool swallowing her thin frame. She was ice cold, her body shaking uncontrollably. I gathered her to her feet, but her legs buckled as if she'd been out there far too long. My throat tightened with rage and sorrow. "What happened?" I asked, but she only shook her head, tears mingling with snowflakes. I half carried her to the truck, shielding her against the storm. My hands trembled as I cranked the heater, wrapping a blanket from the emergency kit around her. She pressed into the warmth like a dying flame, seeking air. Inside the house, laughter rose louder, a cheer for some joke I couldn't hear. My daughter sat in my truck, half frozen, while her husband and his family celebrated without her. Something in me hardened then. A cold resolve deeper than the winter storm. I thought of Martha's necklace in its velvet box, her final words about giving it to Emily when she needed strength. Looking at my daughter's trembling form, I knew the time had come. This wasn't going to be a simple family visit. This Thanksgiving was about to change everything. The heater roared inside the cab, warm air blowing hard enough to rattle the dashboard vents, but it took long minutes before the blue faded from Emily's lips. I held her hands between mine, rubbing them gently, trying to coax life back into her fingers. They were stiff, small icicles in my palms, trembling even as heat returned. She leaned against the seat, eyes half closed, as though every ounce of strength had been stripped away by the cold. I studied her face the way only a father can, not just the surface, but the small changes only years of memory allow you to notice. There were shadows under her eyes, faint lines etched by exhaustion. Her hair, once kept long and free, was pinned back too tightly, strands plastered to her temples by melting snow. The blouse she wore looked thin and delicate, more suited for an indoor gathering than weather that bit straight through bone. When she finally spoke, her voice was raw, each word scraped from a throat that had been too long in the freezing air. I can't go back in there." The words pierced me sharp and merciless. I waited, giving her time, not pressing too quickly. Martha always knew that patience drew truth better than interrogation. She used to tell me, when people are hurting, silence can be the most gentle invitation. Emily pulled the blanket tighter around herself, staring at the fogged windshield. The snow outside blurred the view of the glowing house, where laughter and clinking glasses carried faintly through the storm. "They told me I ruined Thanksgiving," she whispered at last. I frowned. "How could you ruin Thanksgiving?" Her shoulders curled inward as though she were ashamed even to explain. "The stuffing burned. I forgot to take it out when Mark's mother asked me. Just a little too long in the oven, but the smell carried. Everyone noticed. They all looked at me like I was useless. Mark, he said I embarrassed him in front of his family. He told me I needed to learn a lesson. So," her voice cracked, "so they sent me outside. Said I could come back in when I understood responsibility." The rage that flared inside me nearly made my vision blur. My daughter locked out of her own home like a misbehaving child, punished over bread cubes and seasoning. I clenched the steering wheel just to keep from shaking. "How long?" I asked quietly. She hesitated, as if the answer might condemn her further. "Since around 11 this morning." I checked the clock on the dash. It was nearly 3:30, more than 4 hours in a storm that could kill in less time than that. My breath left me in a ragged exhale, part fury, part disbelief. Emily looked at me, then really looked, her eyes filled with the kind of shame that doesn't belong to the guilty, but to the wronged. "Don't be mad, Dad, please. It'll just make things worse if you're angry." That sentence struck deeper than any confession. It told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't afraid of the cold. She was afraid of her husband's anger, his family's judgment of punishment that had clearly stretched beyond this single holiday. I thought back to her wedding day. I remembered how Mark's parents hovered close, controlling details, correcting little things with sharp tones. I remembered how Emily smiled nervously, how she deferred to them on decisions that should have been hers. I had chalked it up to nerves, the chaos of weddings. Now, sitting beside my shivering daughter, I realized it had been the first sign of chains tightening around her. "Emily," I said softly, "has this happened before?" Her lips parted, then closed. She looked away, eyes fixed on the frost forming along the window. Silence stretched heavy and suffocating. Finally, with a small shake of her head that looked more like surrender than denial, she whispered sometimes. The word cracked my heart. She didn't elaborate, but she didn't need to. I saw it all in the way she hunched her shoulders, in the careful way she spoke, in the guilt that stained her, even though she had done nothing wrong. My daughter had been living under rules designed not to guide, but to break her. Snow hammered the truck roof, a steady drumming like war drums in the distance. The storm outside felt almost merciful compared to the storm she had been enduring behind those glowing windows. I wanted to march up to that house, immediately drag Mark and his family into the yard, and demand answers until the whole neighborhood heard. But Emily's trembling voice returned to me. "It'll just make things worse if you're angry." She was still protecting them, still fearing retaliation, even while half frozen. That kind of fear doesn't grow overnight. It takes years of erosion, small cuts that bleed someone's confidence dry. I reached for the velvet box on the seat, opening it just enough to see the glint of Martha's necklace inside. My chest ached. She had known. Somehow, she had known Emily would face a moment when she needed strength greater than her own. This was that moment. I closed the box and slipped it back into my coat pocket. Not yet. Not until the time was right. First, I had to decide what to do. Through the windshield, I could still see shadows moving behind the curtains of the house. Plates passing glasses raised the golden light of celebration. Inside, they were warm, comfortable, smug in their cruelty. Outside, my daughter had nearly frozen to death on their doorstep. No, this couldn't be ignored. Not this time. I looked back at Emily, who had finally stopped shivering, though her eyes still held that hollow look I hated. "You're safe now," I murmured, though the words felt thin against the weight of truth. She closed her eyes and leaned into the blanket. For the first time, her breathing steadied, though I knew real safety was still far away. It wasn't enough to wrap her in heat and hide her in my truck. If I drove her home with me tonight, Mark would come after her tomorrow. He'd twist the story-turned neighbors, even family, against her. He'd make her believe she was the one at fault. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. That wasn't going to happen, not while I was still breathing. My daughter had been frozen outside her own home on Thanksgiving Day, punished like a child for a burnt pan of stuffing. The image would haunt me forever, the sight of her curled on those steps shivering, while laughter rang out inside. That was the moment everything changed. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm building inside me. This Thanksgiving there would be justice. The storm outside didn't let up. Snow pushed hard against the windshield wipers, squealing under the strain, but inside the cab, a fragile pocket of warmth held. Emily huddled beneath the blanket, her face pale against the glow of the dashboard lights. I sat in silence, the engine humming, steady fighting against the urge to explode with questions. She was 26 now. But in that moment, I saw her as the little girl who used to sneak into our bed during thunderstorms, clutching her stuffed rabbit tight, whispering, "Daddy, the thunder's too loud." I had always been her shield, her steady ground. Yet somehow, somewhere along the way, I'd let that role slip from my hands. After several minutes, she broke the silence. It wasn't just today. Her words came quiet, almost lost in the roar of the heater, but I caught them and my heart clenched. I turned slightly, giving her space to continue. She didn't look at me, eyes fixed on the melting snow trailing down the glass. "He does this when I disappoint him," she whispered. "Sometimes it's small. Like if I don't set the table the way his mother likes, he'll tell me to eat in the kitchen by myself. Or if I forget something at the store, he'll make me sleep in the guest room." At first, I thought it was just marriage, adjusting. But it's gotten worse. I felt my hands tighten on my knees. Martha had worried. She'd said once after meeting Mark's parents that control seemed to run in that family like blood. I had brushed it off, wanting to believe Emily had chosen a man who would love her as much as she deserved. I should have looked harder. "What do you mean worse?" My voice came rough, though I tried to keep it steady. Emily pulled the blanket tighter, her shoulders curling in. "Last month, I overcooked the roast. He told me I wasn't allowed to eat with them for a week. He said if I couldn't cook properly, I didn't deserve the privilege of sitting at his table. His parents agreed. They said it was for my own good, and I believed them." I started to believe maybe they were right. Her voice cracked. that maybe I wasn't enough. The shame in her tone sliced through me, sharper than any blade. She had been starved, excluded, humiliated, and made to think it was love. My daughter, the one who used to laugh so freely, now questioning her own worth because a man and his family convinced her she was less. I wanted to storm that house, immediately drag them all into the snow, make them feel every ounce of the cold she had endured. But Emily's fragile posture held me in check. She wasn't ready for fire. She needed steadiness. "You're more than enough," I said firmly, though she didn't look at me. "Don't ever believe otherwise." She shook her head as if rejecting comfort. "Dad, you don't understand. If you go in there angry, it'll just get worse later. He'll twist it, make it all my fault. He'll tell his family I provoked you, that I embarrassed him again. And then—" Her voice trailed off, fear filling the silence. The way she said again told me this wasn't the first time. Mark had been shaping her reality, convincing her that any defense of herself or anyone's defense of her was another sin to punish. I sat back staring through the fogging windshield at the warm windows of the house. From here, it looked perfect. A holiday card scene, golden light spilling onto snow silhouettes moving around a bountiful table. No one glancing toward the door, no one missing Emily's presence. To them, she was an inconvenience set aside so the performance of family harmony could continue. Anger surged in me, hot and bitter, but beneath it, guilt coiled tighter. Had I failed her long before today, I remembered the day she told me she was engaged. I hadn't hidden my unease, but I hadn't fought either. I'd walked her down that aisle, smiled for photos, clinked glasses at toasts. Had I delivered her straight into a cage with my silence? I reached into my coat pocket, feeling the small velvet box once more. Martha's necklace. She had known Emily would need it someday, that she would need something to remind her of who she was, of her strength and worth. I wished Martha were here to see her now, to hold her, to whisper the truths that only a mother can. But she wasn't. It was up to me. Emily's eyes glistened, though she kept them fixed on the snow. Sometimes I wonder if he married me just to have someone to control. I'm not like them. I wasn't raised to think every mistake deserved punishment. But his family, they all act like it's normal. They nod when he scolds me. They stay silent when he locks me out. And I start to question myself. Like maybe I'm broken for not fitting into their idea of love. Her words rattled in me. I thought of every time she had called, sounding tired, her voice careful measured. The times I had brushed it aside, telling myself she was just busy adjusting to married life. I had wanted to believe she was fine because believing otherwise would mean facing my own helplessness. But now helplessness wasn't an option, not anymore. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, staring at the storm-choked street. The snow swallowed sound turning the neighborhood into a muffled dream. But inside me, everything was sharp, burning alive with a clarity I hadn't felt since Martha's funeral. I could see the path ahead as clearly as the snowflakes melting on the glass. Tonight wasn't about politeness or appearances. It wasn't about letting Mark have his way to keep peace. It was about drawing a line, one that could never be crossed again. "Emily," I said quietly, my voice firm but gentle. "You don't have to live like this anymore." Her head jerked slightly as though the thought itself was dangerous. She turned to me, eyes wide with fear and hope tangled together. "He won't let me leave." The words chilled me more than the storm. Won't let me. Not I can't. Not I don't know how. But he won't let me. It was the language of captivity, the acceptance of chains. I swallowed hard, fighting to keep my voice steady. Let me worry about him. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The truck's heater hummed, snow hissed against the windshield, and from the house came the muffled chorus of laughter and clinking dishes. Two worlds separated by one locked door. I knew then what had to happen. This Thanksgiving wasn't going to be like others. It wasn't going to end with polite goodbyes and long drives home. This was the day everything broke open. I looked at my daughter wrapped in my coat, the blanket pulled to her chin, eyes heavy with years of quiet suffering. She didn't see it yet, but the storm outside was nothing compared to the reckoning coming for that house. Tonight, the truth would not stay hidden. The storm rattled on flakes piling against the windshield in restless waves, but my thoughts were louder than the weather. Every breath felt like fire and ice twisting together, anger boiling against a grief I hadn't named until this moment. My daughter had been made small in her own home, reduced to shivering silence on a porch, while others feasted behind locked doors. I gripped the steering wheel as if it could anchor me, the leather stiff beneath my fingers. In that grip, I felt the weight of years, every shift at the factory, every mile I'd driven to keep a roof over our heads, every quiet act Martha and I had done to build a life for Emily. All of it had been so she could feel safe, so she could walk into her adulthood, knowing she was loved. And yet, here she sat wrapped in blankets in the cab of my old truck, her spirit frayed by a man who called himself her husband. The guilt was a heavy stone pressing on my chest. I should have seen it earlier. I should have questioned harder, visited more often, refused to accept the weak excuses. Martha had sensed it. She had that uncanny intuition about people, especially about men who wore charm like a mask. I remembered her words the first time she'd met Mark Henry. He watches her like she's a project to fix, not a partner to cherish. I'd brushed it aside, too eager to believe our daughter had chosen wisely. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the velvet box. The necklace glimmered faintly in the dashboard, light silver twisted into a delicate loop with a single stone set in the center. It was simple, but when Martha wore it, it had always caught eyes. Not because of the metal or the stone, but because of the way it seemed to radiate her strength. She had given it to me with a final request, and I knew she hadn't meant it as just a piece of jewelry. It was a torch to be passed, a reminder to Emily that she came from resilience, from a line of love stronger than cruelty. I opened the box, fully let the necklace rest in my palm. I could almost hear Martha's voice, steady and kind, urging me to act. Don't let fear decide, Henry. Do what's right, even if it costs you comfort. Outside, the house gleamed with golden light, every window a portrait of warmth and belonging. To a stranger, it would look like the perfect Thanksgiving laughter-food family. But I knew better now. That glow was a disguise covering rot beneath. Every cheer that floated through the glass was an insult to the truth my daughter had been exiled to the cold for 4 hours while they filled their plates. Emily stirred beside me, shifting under the blanket, her eyes opening slightly. They looked softer now, dulled by exhaustion, but the lines of fear still traced her face. She didn't speak, but I could sense what she wanted for me to stay quiet, to drive her away from here, to avoid the fight she believed would only bring worse punishment later. But I had lived long enough to know some fights cannot be avoided. Silence was its own kind of betrayal. I thought of all the times I'd told her as a child that I would always protect her. Those words meant nothing if I shrank now. I tucked the necklace back into its box, slid it into my coat pocket, and straightened in the seat. My decision settled over me like steel, cooling into shape. I wasn't going to call the police from the truck and hope they pieced together the truth. I wasn't going to drive away and pretend this was a misunderstanding to be smoothed over later. I was going to walk through that door and face the people who had done this. It wasn't pride. It wasn't even anger anymore, though rage still churned in my gut like a storm tide. It was clarity. My daughter's safety and dignity demanded action. Thanksgiving or not, family gathering or not, I was done letting cruelty masquerade as tradition. I looked at Emily one more time, her small frame curled beneath layers of borrowed warmth. She didn't know it yet, but this night would mark a turning point. The chains she had carried silently would snap, even if she feared the sound of them breaking. My boots hit the frozen ground with a crunch when I stepped out of the truck. The wind slapped my face sharp as shattered glass, but I hardly noticed. The snow fell harder, coating my shoulders, clinging to my hair. Each step toward the house felt deliberate, a drumbeat of resolve against the backdrop of laughter inside. The porch loomed ahead, the same place I had found Emily curled and shivering not long ago. I imagined her sitting there, hour after hour, her teeth chattering, her heart sinking lower with each burst of laughter from within. The thought sharpened my anger into something almost calm. Rage had turned to purpose. I paused at the door, the wreath of autumn leaves hanging cheerful and oblivious. My reflection stared back faintly in the glass pane, older than I remembered, lined by years of labor and loss. But behind that reflection was something steadier, a man who had nothing left to lose but his word. For decades, I had been the kind of man who swallowed pride to keep the peace. At work, at home, even in family matters, I had often chosen quiet endurance over confrontation. Martha balanced me, her patience smoothing my sharper edges. But tonight, there was no one left to balance. Tonight, there was only the truth, and the truth demanded noise. Inside, I heard a burst of laughter louder than before. A man's voice, Mark's I recognized it, rose above the others, boasting about something I couldn't catch. The sound was smug, self-satisfied, the voice of a man who believed he held complete control. I set my jaw, raised my foot, and braced myself. The decision had been made. Tonight, the door would not remain closed. The wreath rattled against the door when my boot struck just beside the lock. The crack of wood splintering echoed across the quiet street, sharp as thunder against the snow-soft night. The door banged inward, slamming the wall so hard a picture frame tilted sideways. For a split second, the golden glow of the dining room spilled into the storm-warm air, rushing past me as though mocking the cold my daughter had endured. I stepped inside, boots heavy on the hardwood. Emily followed, wrapped still in my coat, her body stiff with dread. Her fingers clutched the blanket like armor, and I could feel the tremor in her steps. But she came anyway, because there was no going back to the porch, not tonight. The scene that greeted us froze in my mind like a photograph. The dining table stretched long beneath a white cloth candles flickering along its center. Platters of food gleamed under crystal-light turkey, carved golden brown bowls of mashed potatoes draped in butter pies lined up at the edge like trophies. Mark sat at the head of the table, carving knife still in hand, his shirt crisp, his hair neatly combed as though for a magazine spread. Around him, his family filled the seats, his mother in pearls, his father, with wine glass, raised a sister laughing mid-gesture. They were caught in the act of celebration faces, flushed with food and drink cheer, suspended in mid-air. Then silence. Forks clattered against plates as eyes turned toward us. The warmth of the room seemed to curdle into shock. Emily shrank behind me, her body half hidden, but I stood firm in the doorway chest, rising with controlled fury. While you sat here feasting, I said, my voice low, but carrying my daughter froze on your porch for 4 hours. The words cut through the hush like a blade. Mark blinked, his expression shifting from surprise to irritation. Slowly, he set down the carving knife, wiping his hands on a linen napkin with a calmness that felt more dangerous than any shout. This is private property, he said, his tone smooth but cold. You've just broken into my home. I stepped forward, boots thudding against the rug. Don't talk to me about property. Talk to me about why my daughter was locked outside like an animal while you filled your stomach. Emily flinched at my tone, and I forced myself to breathe slower. She had endured enough shouting for a lifetime, but I couldn't soften the truth. Not anymore. Mark's mother pursed her lips, setting down her glass. She burned the stuffing, she said matter-of-factly, as if that explained everything. She embarrassed the family. Actions have consequences. Consequences. The word burned in my ears. I looked back at Emily, her eyes lowered, shame pulling her shoulders inward, and I knew this wasn't the first time that word had been used against her like a whip. Mark rose slowly from his chair, a deliberate show of authority. He was taller than me, broader in the shoulders, but I had spent a lifetime lifting steel and lumber. Age had weathered me, not weakened me. He walked around the table, his steps measured, his chin tilted in confidence. You don't belong here, he said, stopping just a few feet from me. This is between me and my wife. I held his gaze unblinking. You mean the wife you left to freeze while you played king of the table? No. This is between me and the man who thinks cruelty is discipline. A murmur rippled through the family, some shifting uncomfortably, others crossing their arms in defiance. I noticed one of Mark's uncles staring at his plate, unwilling to meet my eyes. But no one spoke against him. Silence can be as loud as complicity. I pointed at the table, the glistening turkey, the polished silver. Look at this. Look at what you made important while my daughter sat outside fighting frostbite. Do you know how close she came to hypothermia? Do you care? Mark's jaw tightened. She'll survive. A little cold teaches humility. That sentence sealed it. No apology, no recognition of harm, only justification. I stepped closer, closing the space between us. The smell of wine lingered on his breath, the faint smugness of a man too certain of his own authority. My voice dropped lower, colder. You have 30 seconds to admit what you did and apologize to her. Or I will make sure this night doesn't end the way you planned. His laugh was short, sharp, meant to belittle. You think you can threaten me in my own home? Behind me, I felt Emily's hand brush my sleeve, trembling. It wasn't a plea for me to stop. It was fear of what might follow. She had learned that every challenge, every stand came with retaliation later. But tonight wasn't going to follow that script. I took another step so close now that our reflections merged in the glossy surface of a framed family photo hanging on the wall. A picture of Mark with his parents and siblings, Emily tucked at the edge like an afterthought. I glanced at it, then back at him. That woman, I said, nodding toward Emily, is my daughter. She is not your servant. She is not your scapegoat, and she will never again sit outside while you decide whether she's worthy of warmth. The words hung heavy, thick with finality. The family sat frozen forks halfway to Mel's eyes, darting between us like spectators at a match. Mark smirked, arms folding across his chest. Then take her. If she doesn't like my rules, she doesn't have to live under my roof. The arrogance, the dismissal almost made me laugh. He thought he had won, framing himself as generous, giving her permission to leave. But what he didn't realize was that the moment she walked out that door with me, the illusion of his control would shatter. I turned to Emily, who stood trembling near the entryway. Her eyes met mine for the first time since we'd entered wide and wet, searching for something safety, direction, courage. Get your things, I said softly to her, steady and calm. You're coming with me. A collective gasp fluttered around the table. Mark's father slammed his hand down. This is kidnapping. But the only sound that mattered was Emily's small, shaky inhale as she realized the choice had already been made. I stayed rooted, my eyes locked on Mark, whose smirk faltered for the first time. He had expected fear, hesitation, negotiation. Instead, he found resolve. Behind him, the golden turkey gleamed, candles flickering in their holders. A feast built on cruelty, a table set over silence. I wanted to burn the memory of it into his mind, the night when his empire of intimidation cracked under the weight of truth. Emily's steps were tentative as she moved toward the staircase. I stayed close, my body a shield, my presence a promise. The house was still the air thick with unspoken threats. But for the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in Mark's eyes. And that was enough to know the fight had truly begun. The house seemed to shrink around us as Emily's footsteps creaked up the staircase, each step trembling but determined. The family's eyes followed her like vultures tracking prey, their perfect feast, forgotten, their wine glasses stilled in midair. Only the fire crackled in the corner, snapping softly as if mocking the tension it now illuminated. Mark didn't move to stop her, not yet. He stood there, arms folded across his chest posture, radiating smug confidence. His family watched him for cues, every one of them tethered to his certainty. They had built a world where his word was law, and my daughter was the subject to be disciplined. You're making a mistake, Mark said, finally, his voice calm but dangerous, like ice over deep water. You're interfering in matters you don't understand. I stepped closer, the soles of my boots pressing into the expensive rug, melting flecks of snow into dark patches. What I understand, I said evenly, is that no decent man locks his wife out in freezing weather for a burnt pan of stuffing. His jaw tightened, though he kept the smirk. Discipline builds character. She needs to learn responsibility. Responsibility. The word sat heavy in the air, twisted into a weapon. I thought of Emily's shame in the truck, the way she had whispered, "Maybe I'm not enough." Years of being told that her worth was measured by perfection, her place in the family determined by her obedience. Responsibility wasn't what he taught her. Submission was. The silence stretched. Mark's father shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his tie, as though he could smooth out the ugliness of what had been revealed. His mother's lips pressed tighter, pearls at her neck trembling with each indignant breath. None of them spoke. Silence was their armor, their agreement that the rules of this house were untouchable. I glanced at the table. Plates, half-filled glasses, half-raised turkey carved with precision. It was a painting of abundance, but all I saw was rot. This was what they valued more than my daughter's humanity, a meal unmarred by imperfection, a performance of family unity built on cruelty. Let me tell you something, I said, voice low, each word deliberate. Discipline is teaching your child to stand tall, not making her bow until her back breaks. Responsibility is guiding with love, not locking someone in the cold until their lips turn blue. What you've done isn't teaching. It's abuse. The word landed like a stone thrown through glass. Abuse. Their faces twitched, eyes darting. But still, no one contradicted me. Mark leaned in, his voice dropping to a hiss meant only for me. Say what you want. She always comes back. She needs me. I met his stare, unflinching. She doesn't need you. She needs freedom. Upstairs, I heard the faint thump of drawers opening, the scrape of a suitcase zipper. Emily was moving quickly, fear fueling her hands. That sound gave me strength. She was claiming pieces of herself back. Mark finally stepped toward the stairs, but I shifted, blocking his path. The old factory strength surged through me, years of lifting, hauling, building, and though my hair was gray and my back had stiffened with age, I was still solid, still immovable. "Move," he said low and hard. No, the word came out like iron, not loud, but unshakable. For the first time, his smirk faltered. Behind him, his sister finally spoke, her voice, a whisper edged with unease. "Mark, maybe this isn't—" "Quiet," he snapped without looking at her. Authority snapped back into place, but the crack in his armor had been revealed. I thought of Martha again, her steady wisdom, her patience. She would have tried to reason with him to find a thread of humanity to tug, but Martha wasn't here, and this man had shown he had no humanity to spare. "You've had years to change," I said, my tone steady. "Years where you could have chosen kindness over control. Tonight is the last night you get to decide how Emily lives." For a moment, the room held its breath. The candles flickered, the fire popped, and the storm outside pressed snow against the windows like an audience waiting for the outcome. Mark sneered. "You think you're rescuing her? She won't last a week without me. She doesn't have money, doesn't have anyone. She'll crawl back." The arrogance in his words was almost laughable, but I didn't laugh. I thought of Emily's eyes in the truck filled with shame and fear. I thought of her voice breaking as she confessed the punishments, the exile, the endless belittlement. And then I thought of the necklace in my pocket, Martha's final gift, the torch of strength meant for this exact moment. "She won't crawl back," I said quietly, "because she has me, and that's more than you'll ever be." A sound came from the stairs, then Emily's steps, quick but cautious. She appeared in the hallway, duffel bag slung over her shoulder, her face pale but resolute. For the first time that night, she wasn't hiding behind me. She looked directly at Mark, her eyes shimmering with a mixture of fear and defiance. His face-darkened jaw, clenched fists tightening at his sides. For a moment, I thought he might strike her right there in front of everyone, but he didn't move. Maybe it was my presence standing like a wall between them. Maybe it was the family finally watching, not with complicity, but with uneasy awareness. Or maybe it was the storm outside whispering that his reign had reached its end. Emily adjusted the strap on her shoulder, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm leaving." It was only 3 words, but in them was everything: the years of silence, the bruises. No one saw the shame that had weighed her down. They cracked open the air, undeniable, irreversible. Mark laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Go then. You'll regret it." But his words no longer held power, not over her. I placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her gently but firmly toward the door. The family sat frozen, trapped in their own silence. Mark stood, rigid fury burning in his eyes, but his voice failed him. The golden turkey cooled on the table. The candles burned lower. The perfect feast was broken. For the first time in years, Emily walked out of that house not as a prisoner, but as my daughter, free, trembling, and brave. And I knew the real battle had only just begun. The staircase creaked beneath our steps as Emily led me upward, her duffel bag bouncing lightly against her hip. She clutched it like a lifeline, her knuckles white against the strap. Behind us, the dining room buzzed with low murmurs, Mark's family whispering among themselves, but making no move to stop us. Only Mark's heavy footsteps followed, close the sound of a predator pacing just out of reach. The hallway upstairs was narrow, lined with family photos in polished frames. Most of them showed Mark at different stages of life: boyhood baseball teams, college graduation, family vacations, where Emily stood at the edge of the frame, smiling faintly, as if pasted in afterward. My heart twisted at the sight. These walls displayed ownership, not partnership. Her life had been absorbed into his, her presence treated as accessory rather than equal. Emily pushed open the door to a small bedroom at the end of the hall. The air inside was cool, stale, as if the room had been neglected. The twin bed was neatly made but lacked warmth, no soft blankets, no framed photos of friends, no sign of comfort. It looked less like a woman's space and more like a storage room that had been reluctantly given a bed. "This is where you sleep?" I asked, though the answer was obvious. She nodded, dropping the bag on the bed. "He said the master bedroom was for him. For us at first. But later it became just for him. His parents stay there when they visit. His sister has the guest room. This," she glanced around, her voice trailing off, "this is where I belong." The words chilled me more than the storm outside. A young woman, my only daughter, confined to a box room in her own house, while her husband and his family claimed every other corner as theirs. I steadied myself, stepping further inside. No, this is where they put you, not where you belong. Emily opened the dresser drawers with quick, jerky movements, pulling out folded clothes and stuffing them into the bag. Her hands shook as she moved, but there was a quiet urgency in her motions. Each shirt, each sweater she shoved inside was a small act of defiance, a reclaiming of what had been taken. Mark appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame. His face was a mask of controlled fury, lips pressed tight, eyes burning. "Take what you want," he said flatly, "but don't think you're coming back." Emily froze at the sound of his voice, her shoulders tensing as if bracing for impact. I placed myself between them, my body a shield. "That's the idea," I said. He sneered, glancing around the room. "You think you're rescuing her old man. She's nothing without this house, without me. You'll see." The words made Emily's breath hitch, but she kept packing, folding faster now, as though the act itself could drown him out. I stayed silent, letting the rustle of fabric and the storm outside fill the space. She moved to the closet, pulling down a small box from the top shelf. I caught a glimpse of its contents, a framed photo of her and Martha from years ago, the two of them in aprons, laughing over a Thanksgiving pie. My chest ached at the sight. Emily tucked it into the bag carefully, as though protecting something sacred. Mark's voice dropped lower. "You'll regret this." Emily stopped clutching the box against her chest. For a moment she stood still, then slowly turned to face him. Her voice was quiet, but clear, steadier than I'd heard all night. "The only thing I regret," she said, "is believing you when you told me I deserved it." The words landed like a hammer. Mark's jaw clenched, but he didn't move. His family hovered downstairs, silent, waiting. The walls of his kingdom trembled, and he knew it. Emily zipped the duffel bag closed, slung it over her shoulder, and looked at me. Her eyes shimmered with tears, but they also held something new: resolve. Not strength fully formed, but the fragile spark of it, the first breath after years of suffocation. "Ready?" I asked softly. She nodded. We stepped back into the hallway. Mark moved aside, though his glare followed us, a silent promise of vengeance. His hand twitched as though he wanted to grab her, to pull her back, but he didn't dare. Not with me there, not with the storm outside pressing against the windows like judgment itself. The descent down the staircase was slower, heavier. Emily's bag thumped against the railing, the sound punctuating the silence below. Mark's family sat rigid at the table plates, untouched eyes darting between us and him. Some looked angry, others uneasy, but none offered words. Complicity sat heavy in the air. At the bottom of the stairs, Mark's father finally spoke, his voice low and venomous. "You'll destroy this family." I met his gaze, unblinking. Family destroys itself when it chooses cruelty over love. The man's lips pressed tight, but he said nothing more. The front door still bore the splintered mark of my boot, hanging slightly ajar against the storm. Cold air swept into the entryway, fluttering napkins on the table, dimming the candles. The warmth of their perfect dinner was leaking into the night, just as Emily's silence had begun to leak into truth. We stepped toward the open door, each stride heavier with finality. Behind us, Mark's voice rose once more, sharp and desperate. "If you leave, don't ever expect to come back. You'll have nothing. No house, no money, no family." Emily paused in the doorway. Her shoulders lifted and fell in a deep breath. Then she turned her head just enough to look back. "I'd rather have nothing than live like I'm nothing." With that, she stepped into the storm. I followed, pulling the door wide, letting the wind rush in and scatter the scent of turkey and wine. Mark's voice cut off behind us. The sound of the house, its smug laughter, its polished warmth vanished into the blizzard. Snow swirled around us, stinging against our cheeks, but the air felt cleaner, sharper. Emily pulled my coat tighter around herself, her bag heavy on her shoulder, her steps unsteady but forward. We crossed the driveway to my truck exhaust puffing like a steady breath in the cold. I opened the passenger door for her, and she climbed in without hesitation. For the first time since I'd arrived, I saw her exhale a breath that looked like release. I slid into the driver's seat, the storm howling outside, the heater humming inside. Emily leaned back, her head against the seat, eyes closing. The house loomed behind us, its lights glowing falsely through the snow, but we didn't look back again. The storm followed us home. Snow lashed against the windshield flakes, piling fast on the hood wipers, struggling to keep up. Emily sat silent in the passenger seat, her bag tucked against her knees, my coat pulled high around her chin. She hadn't said much since we left the house, and I didn't press her. Sometimes words were too fragile to bear weight after years of silence. Sometimes just the rhythm of the road, the hum of tires on slick pavement was enough. I kept both hands firm on the wheel, the same way I had through every rough stretch of life. My thoughts churned what next, how to keep her safe, what storms we hadn't yet seen. I thought of Mark's face when she said she regretted believing him. The fury in his eyes had promised this wasn't over. By the time we pulled into my driveway, the sky was ink black, the storm easing just enough for the porch light to cut a steady circle through the snow. My small ranch house looked warmer than I'd ever seen it, almost alive. Maybe it was because Emily was here with me now, stepping out of the truck, into the glow, her duffel slung heavy on her shoulder. Inside the house smelled faintly of coffee and wood smoke. Martha's old quilt hung across the couch, the kind of comfort Emily hadn't felt in years. She dropped her bag beside the guest room door and sank onto the couch, staring at the fire I'd stoked earlier that morning. Her face softened in the flickering light, but the hollow in her eyes remained. I wanted to say something, words about safety, about starting over, about how she'd never be alone again. But before I could, a sharp knock rattled the front door. 3 hard, insistent pounds that vibrated through the floorboards. Emily jumped, her whole body stiffening. The blanket slipped from her shoulders, her breath quick and eyes darting to me in panic. She didn't need to say it. We both knew who it was. I rose slowly, steadying myself. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by voices. Firm, authoritative voices. Police, open up. Through the peephole, I saw 2 officers standing on the porch, snow clinging to their jackets. Behind them, half shrouded by the storm, stood Mark and his parents, their shapes unmistakable even through the curtain of white. I opened the door, letting the cold rush in. Evening, officers, I said, my voice steady. What's this about? Mark stepped forward, immediately finger-jabbing toward me. This man kidnapped my wife. He broke into my home, destroyed my property, and dragged her away against her will. The officers held up their hands, motioning for silence. One, older with tired eyes, turned to me. Sir, we received a call regarding a possible domestic abduction. Do you have a woman named Emily Cole here? Yes, I said calmly. My daughter is here. She came with me voluntarily. She's lying, Mark snapped. She doesn't know what she's saying. He's been poisoning her against us for years. Ask her. Emily's face appeared in the hallway, pale, fearful, but visible. She hesitated, frozen in the glow of the firelight, then stepped forward. Her voice trembled, but she forced the words out. I came with him because I wanted to. I don't want to go back. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the storm howling against the porch. Mark's jaw tightened, his fists clenched at his sides. His mother gasped, hand flying to her pearls as though Emily's words were blasphemy. The younger officer pulled out a notepad. Ma'am, can you clarify? Were you being held outside your house today against your will? Emily swallowed, glancing at me for courage. I gave a small nod, the kind a father gives when steadying a child's first steps. She turned back to the officer. Yes. I was told to sit outside as punishment. I wasn't allowed back in. Mark barked a bitter laugh. Punishment. It was a lesson she ruined. Thanksgiving dinner embarrassed us in front of family. She needed to learn consequences. The officer's pen scratched across paper. How long were you outside, ma'am? Her voice cracked but held steady. Since 11. Until my dad arrived. Over 4 hours. Even the older officer's brows drew tight at that. In this weather. Emily nodded. I didn't have a coat. He locked the door. The words spilled into the air like confession, and once spoken, they couldn't be taken back. Mark stepped forward, furious. She's exaggerating. She could have come back in any time if she'd apologized. No, Emily said sharply, her voice rising for the first time. You told me not to come back inside until I understood. You locked the door. You made me sit there while you laughed and ate without me. Her voice cracked, tears spilling, but the truth stood tall. The officers exchanged glances, their faces grave. Mark sputtered, searching for control, but it slipped further with every word Emily spoke. His mother clutched his arm, whispering, "Don't say any more." His father glared at Emily, muttering about family loyalty, but the officers had heard enough. The older one turned to Mark. "Sir, I need you to step back. There are serious concerns of domestic abuse here. We'll need to file a report." Mark's face flushed crimson. "You can't be serious. She's my wife. This is my house. I have every right." Not to endanger her life, the officer cut in firmly. The storm outside screamed louder, rattling the windows as though the world itself was siding with the truth. Emily trembled, but she didn't retreat. She stood beside me now, her shoulders hunched, but her chin-lifted eyes shimmering with the fragile light of someone who had finally been heard. Mark glared at me across the threshold, his fury boiling over. "You'll pay for this," he hissed. But I only looked back steady, unmoved, not half as much as she already has. The officers positioned themselves between us, guiding Mark and his parents back into the storm. His shouts carried into the night, muffled by the wind, until finally the door closed and silence fell inside the house once more. Emily crumpled into the couch, her face buried in her hands. She wept not the quiet, guilty tears of someone apologizing for their pain, but deep, wrenching sobs of release. I sat beside her, my arm around her shoulders, letting her shake and cry. The fire burned low, the storm raged high, but for the first time that night, my daughter wasn't alone. The storm swallowed their voices as the door closed. For a moment, all I could hear was the thump of my own heartbeat and the faint hiss of snow pressed against the windows. The officers had left with promises to file reports and follow up, though they hadn't placed cuffs on Mark that night. They wanted evidence statements, paperwork. Systems moved slowly, even when cruelty was obvious. But I wasn't worried. Truth had already cracked open, and there was no patching it shut. Emily sat on the couch, shoulders curled forward, face buried in her hands. Her body shook in uneven waves, not just from exhaustion, but from the weight of everything she had carried finally spilling out. Her sobs weren't the quiet, muffled kind she'd probably learned to hide in that house. These were raw, guttural, shaking sobs, the sound of years collapsing. I sat beside her, saying nothing. Words felt too small. I simply wrapped an arm around her shoulders, let her lean into me, let her grief pour out until the room itself seemed soaked in it. My shirt grew damp against her cheek, but I didn't move. I'd sat with Martha through nights of sickness, through hours when her body betrayed her, but her spirit still fought. I knew sometimes the only medicine was presence. When Emily's sobs finally softened to shallow breaths, she whispered, "I'm sorry." The apology pierced me like a knife. What could you possibly be sorry for? Her voice cracked almost too soft to hear. For not leaving sooner, for letting him do this to me, for making you see it. I shook my head, gripping her hand firmly. "Don't you dare carry that blame. You didn't make him cruel. You didn't lock yourself out in the cold. You didn't shrink your own voice. That was him. That was them. Not you." Her eyes shimmered, red-rimmed and raw. She nodded faintly, but I could see the war still raging inside her. Shame doesn't dissolve in one night. It lingers stubborn as frost. I rose and went to the kitchen, the old linoleum creaking beneath my boots. The motions grounded me, filling the kettle, setting it on the stove, pulling mugs from the cabinet. I brewed tea the way Martha used to, strong and steady honey instead of sugar. When I carried the mugs back, the steam curled upward, filling the air with something warm and human. Emily took hers with trembling hands, the cup rattling faintly against its saucer. We sat in silence, sipping slowly. The fire cracked in the hearth, throwing shadows that danced across the room. For the first time since she'd arrived, I saw a flicker of peace on her face. Not relief, not yet, but the tiniest release, like the first thaw after winter. After a while, she spoke again. "They'll never forgive me." Her words hung heavy. She wasn't just talking about Mark. She meant his family, the whole nest that had circled around her and closed in. "You don't need their forgiveness," I said. "You need your life back." She stared into her tea. "But I lived with them for years. I tried so hard to be what they wanted. Maybe if I'd just—" "Don't." My voice came firm, sharper than I intended. I set my mug down and turned to her. "Don't finish that thought. I spent half my life believing I wasn't enough for Martha. Not enough money, not enough ease, not enough to make her days brighter when her body was failing. She told me one night, "Henry, love isn't about earning, it's about being. You don't earn love, Emily. You never did. And if someone makes you believe you have to, it isn't love." Her lips trembled. She nodded once slow, as though the truth was too heavy to absorb all at once. The storm outside eased, snow falling softer now, the wind losing its teeth. Inside, the air felt warmer, calmer. Emily leaned back, the blanket slipping from her shoulders as she sank into the couch. For the first time, she didn't look like she was waiting for the next order, the next punishment. She looked tired, bone-deep, soul-deep tired, but there was space for something else now. I thought of the velvet box still in my coat pocket. My hand brushed against it, and I knew the time had come. I pulled it out, opened it slowly, and held the necklace out to her. Her eyes widened. "Mom's." I nodded. "She wanted you to have it when you needed strength." My throat tightened. I think tonight qualifies. Emily's fingers trembled as she lifted the necklace from its box. The silver caught the firelight, glowing faintly. She held it against her chest, eyes glistening. "I thought I'd lost her," she whispered. "She's here," I said softly. "Every time you stand up, every time you refuse to let cruelty define you, she's here." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but this time they were different. Softer, not collapse, but release. She clasped the necklace around her neck, the pendant resting just above her heart. For the first time that night, she smiled small but real. We talked little after that. The exhaustion pressed in, the kind that seeps deeper than muscle. Emily dozed on the couch, her head resting against the armrest, the necklace glinting with each rise of her breath. I covered her with Martha's quilt, the same one that had warmed her as a child. I sat in the armchair across from her, watching the fire burn low, listening to the storm finally quiet outside. My mind churned with questions about what tomorrow would bring. There would be hearings, maybe lawyers, maybe a courtroom. Mark wouldn't surrender easily. His threats echoed in my ears, promises of revenge, of reclaiming control. But tonight wasn't about tomorrow. Tonight was about this moment my daughter safe, under my roof, her voice finally spoken, her chains finally cracking. I closed my eyes, letting the warmth of the fire and the steady rhythm of her breathing settle into me. For the first time since Martha's passing, the house didn't feel empty. It felt alive again, fragile but real, a place where healing could take root. Tomorrow would come, but tonight, we had survived. Winter passed like a long breath, held too tightly, then finally exhaled. By March, the snow had melted into rivulets along the roadside, and the grass in my yard began peeking green again. The house smelled different now, fresher, lighter, like air that had finally been let in after years of being shut out. Emily had moved into the guest room full-time, though she never called it that anymore. It was her room decorated with quilts framed photos she'd unearthed from storage, even a small potted plant on the windowsill that leaned stubbornly toward the sun. The necklace never left her neck. I'd see it glint in the morning light, and every time it felt like Martha's quiet blessing over us both. The legal process had unfolded slowly, as it always does. Police reports became hearings. Hearings became statements. Mark shouted through lawyers, through paperwork, through threats that never quite reached us. In the end, truth held firm. The abuse couldn't be denied once Emily's testimony was backed by neighbors, by texts, by small scraps of evidence that painted a larger, undeniable picture. Mark had moved out of town, his pride trailing after him like smoke. His family had retreated into silence, their holiday feasts suddenly absent of the daughter-in-law they had once treated as invisible. Emily didn't speak much of them anymore. She let their names fade from her vocabulary, replaced by new words, job applications, therapy sessions, evening classes. Her days became hers again. One morning, I found her at the kitchen table with a stack of papers spread across the surface, college brochures, financial aid forms, pamphlets about counseling programs. Her hair was tucked behind her ears, her eyes bright with something I hadn't seen in years' anticipation. "I think I want to go back to school," she said, almost shyly. "Social work, maybe. Or counseling. I want to help women who've been where I was." I felt my throat tighten. Pride isn't a big enough word for what filled me then. It wasn't just pride. It was relief, gratitude, and the bone-deep knowledge that Martha would be smiling. "That sounds just right," I said. "You'd be damn good at it." She smiled softly, the kind of smile that doesn't have to ask permission. Our life settled into routines that were small but rich. We cooked together, most nights nothing fancy, just hearty meals that filled the house with the smell of garlic and bread. Sometimes she would hum while chopping vegetables, a sound I hadn't realized I missed until it returned. Evenings we spent by the fire, her reading on the couch while I worked crosswords in my chair. The quiet felt different now, not heavy, but safe. She got a part-time job at the library in town. I still remember the first evening she came home, cheeks flushed from the cold and eyes lit up. "Dad," she said, holding out a worn paperback. "They let me take it home early. I've got my own staff card." It was such a small thing, a plastic rectangle with her name on it, but I saw what it meant. She belonged somewhere again. Healing isn't neat. It doesn't unfold in straight lines. There were nights when she woke up sweating breath shallow, the echoes of Mark's voice still chasing her through her dreams. On those nights, I'd sit with her in the kitchen, the kettle hissing as I made tea, reminding her softly, "He's not here. You're safe now." Slowly, the nightmares came less often. Slowly, she began to believe her own safety. 4 months after that bitter Thanksgiving, the town held its spring fair on the courthouse lawn. Tents sprouted like flowers, the air thick with kettle corn and laughter. Emily insisted we go. She wanted to be among people again, she said, to prove to herself that she could. We walked through rows of booths together, the sun bright overhead. She paused to buy a small charm from a local craftsman, running her fingers over the silver engraving. The vendor smiled at her necklace and said, "That pendant looks like it's been through some things." Emily smiled back, her eyes steady. "So have I." That night, back at the house, we sat on the porch as the sun dipped low. The air was cool, carrying the scent of fresh earth and cut grass. Emily leaned back in her chair, her feet tucked beneath her, the necklace glinting softly. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked quietly. "Every day," I admitted, "but not the part where I kicked the door, not the fight. I think about you walking out with your bag. I think about you saying, 'I'd rather have nothing than live like I'm nothing.'" Her eyes shimmered. "That was the first time I believed I deserved more." I nodded, staring at the horizon. "You always deserved more. You just needed to believe it too." Silence stretched, but it was the good kind, full of peace instead of fear. The cicadas hummed, the stars blinked awake, and for the first time in years, Emily looked weightless. As the evening faded into night, I realized something simple but profound. Thanksgiving hadn't been destroyed for us. It had been remade. That day no longer belonged to Mark, to his family, to cruelty disguised as order. It belonged to Emily's courage, to the fire in her voice, when she finally said no to the splintered wood of a door that would never again keep her locked out. When she rose to go inside, she paused at the doorway and looked back at me. Her smile was faint but sure, and her voice carried steady through the twilight. "Thanks for coming for me, Dad." I swallowed hard, my chest aching. "Always." The porch light clicked on spilling warmth across the yard, and just like that, the world felt whole again, fragile, imperfect, but full of hope. Martha would have been proud.